Hello everyone, in this recording we're going to talk about the kinds of user queries that are often common when you have graph data. So, first of all, graphs are very common, right? They arise across many different fields. Whenever you have a notion of interaction between units, then you can often think about it as a graph. So, I listed a bunch of examples here. Here are two specific pictures, right? So you can think of an evolutionary tree as a kind of graph, right? So you have a link when you have an ancestor and its descendants. This is kind of an epidemiological network. So this is from a paper about COVID transmission. So an edge means there was a transmission from one person to the next. Okay, so that's just to say there are a lot of graph data out there. Now, when you visualize something, you should always have certain kinds of queries in mind. Why are you visualizing the data, right? And from one point of view, there are really only two essential kinds of queries for graph data. Right? The first kind of query is topological, the second is attributional. Topological is asking some information about the neighborhood structure, right? So going from one node to the next, is there a path or not, right? Or how many hops might it be? So that's a kind of topological query. An attributional query is something like, where are the nodes that have a certain attribute, right? Or kind of, if you have different kinds of transmission structure, like how many of the edges came from one type of transmission versus another, right? You can think of each node and each edge as having some property, and you might want to do some filtering or identification associated with those properties. But that's the kind of very reductionist point of view, this topological versus attributional query, right? Those are very node-centric questions. You can take a more holistic point of view as well. And this is often something that people will be interested in. You might look for these kind of global structures. So global structure could be, are there large clusters of nodes where there's really dense connections within the cluster, but not so much going outside? Do you have hubs, so nodes with many, many neighbors? Are there central nodes? So maybe like you have two clusters and then a small bottleneck where if you want to link between the two clusters, you have to pass through these central nodes. So, these are all kind of more holistic properties of the network, and those are also often interesting. Okay, so those are the kinds of queries that are the most common. Now, there are lots and lots of ways of visualizing graph data. This is one of these very active areas of research. So why is it so common? It's because there's quite a bit of difficulty in visualizing graphs. Right? So for a lot of these kinds of queries, there's no obvious solution. So an example, right? Here is kind of a naive approach to showing links between pairs of nodes, right? So you've laid out all the nodes in this big radial structure, and then you draw a link if they're connected. If you just do kind of the naive linking, this is almost impossible to read. Like maybe you can tell that like this set of nodes has a lot of outgoing connections, and it has a group here, but not so much connections with here. Right? So you can sort of tell, but it's very difficult. If you instead are able to hierarchically organize the edges, and kind of group them into these sort of like traffic flows, then all of a sudden a lot more clear structure emerges. Right? You can see that these kind of three groups are blending into one, that this structure breaks into these three, that there's this second channel that I wouldn't have even really noticed in this view. Right? So kind of a specific example where you're able to minimize this kind of occlusion and edge crossing to make a clearer view. Here's another kind of way of reducing that edge crossing. Right? Instead of showing this sort of little tightly bundled thing, you can lay it out as an adjacency matrix view. And we'll see specific examples of this soon. The idea is, instead of showing links between the nodes, you draw all the nodes as both columns and rows, and then you kind of fill in the square if there's a link between them. Right, so since green and blue have a link, you put a dark square here. So from this, this little blue group, you can see much more clearly that they're actually all interconnected except for maybe 2 or 3. Okay. A final point. Sometimes with interactive graphs especially, it's very tempting to have lots of moving things, right? But that can actually make it very difficult to read. So something you're going to want to try to pay attention to when you're working with interactive graphs is minimize the amount of motion, right? Only change the things that are really relevant for the query.